It's Tuesday, February 1st, 2022. My name is Ashton Ellett, Politics and Public Policy Archivist at the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies at the University of Georgia. I'm here today at Denton's in Washington, D.C. with Bob Hurt for another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project. A Georgia native, Mr. Hurt is a graduate of Mercer University in Macon, where he majored in history, edited the campus newspaper, The Cluster, and served as an Army ROTC cadet. Bob secured a job with the Atlanta Constitution following graduation, but he first had to fulfill his military commitment, which he did as an infantry and intelligence officer with the Sky Soldiers of the 173rd Airborne and the 5th Special Forces Group. Afterward, Bob returned to Atlanta as a reporter at the Constitution and became the paper's Washington correspondent in 1970. Bob left the paper a few years later to join the staff of U.S. Representative Ronald Beau. He would go on to serve as Chief of Staff for Representative Lindsey Thomas and Senator Sam Nunn. After almost a quarter century on Capitol Hill, Bob founded Hurt Norton Associates, a full-service government affairs, marketing, and lobbying firm, in 1997, where he served as president until his very recent retirement in 2021. So Bob, thank you so much for taking some time this morning to talk history and politics with me. I really appreciate that. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also thank Randy Knuckles and everyone here at Denton's for their hospitality and willingness to host us. So thank you to them as well. I'm wondering, if we could begin, tell us a little bit about your childhood and upbringing. Where did you grow up? What did your parents do? That sort of thing.
Delighted, and thank you for the honor of being interviewed.
Absolutely.
I'll try to speak in complete sentences and through it. My parents moved to Atlanta when I was 4 years old. My father was a journalist by training. He'd been a Memphis Commercial Appeal reporter and an Associated Press reporter. AP wanted to send him to New York to be an editor. He said, "I will not raise my sons on the streets of New York City." So he looked for another job, and with my mother and 5-year older brother, moved to Atlanta when I was about 4. He was editor of the Christian Index, which is the state Baptist newspaper. He was very proud of the fact that he was a layman and a professional journalist. Most folks who'd had that position had been ministers. Mm-hmm. He also frequently reminded me that his weekly circulation of 100,000 was more than the Atlanta Constitution later worked. So I grew up in Atlanta, went to Mercer, as you mentioned, and was editor of the paper there, and it was an exciting time. That's when Mercer desegregated at its initiative to invite Sam Oney and 2 great African Americans from Macon there, and that was a big story. Got to know Sam very well as a journalist then, and had the honor actually of doing a Founders Day speech at Mercer a few years ago honoring that anniversary, and Sam is a great friend today. Interned with the Constitution in summers and went to work for the Constitution after I graduated in 65. And as you mentioned, I worked there for about 1.5 years before doing my active duty service in the Army in Vietnam. Came back, interestingly, about 3 weeks after Dr. Martin Luther King had been assassinated.
Okay.
And the editor, I think, I had no idea why, but I came in that morning and he gave me the job of writing the 1 month after the assassination story for the Atlanta Constitution, which was a challenge since I had not even been in the country when that happened. Fortunately, the grizzled old police reporter of the Constitution then, Keeler McCartney, was a good friend, gave me some tips, and we were able to break the fact that James Earl Ray had tracked King through Atlanta just a few weeks before the assassination, looking for an opportunity. But loved the paper, enjoyed that work. One of the editors, Jim Rankin, suggested I apply for a fellowship through the Kiplinger Foundation to go to Washington, I think for 3 months, series of panels and sessions to teach young journalists about Washington, with the hopes that then they would return to their native papers or TV stations and be more knowledgeable about Washington. I was pleased to be selected to do that, so I moved to Washington in 1970, planning to be there 3 months.
How'd that work
still
out?
Here. So at that time, the papers, the Constitution, the Journal, although owned by the same company, operated on separate floors of the old journal building there with the printing press that made the building vibrate every night, and we were bitter rivals. The correspondent in D.C. for the Constitution wanted to go home with his family. I was there. I was cheap, so they left me. I covered the delegation in that way for about a little over 2 years. Basically was looking for Washington angles to Georgia stories. Of course, I covered the Georgia delegation. The senators at that time were Talmadge and Russell. Enjoyed that, but wanted to, after a while, get a job with that paid more, which at that point, Capitol Hill could pay more. Also, I got in a fight with one of my editors. He was changing my stories. I didn't like it.
Now, which editor would that be?
Well, it would be Bill Shipp. Bill's a great writer, but we did not see eye to eye about
Sure.
various things that he would put in the stories. And so he wanted me to come back to Atlanta, and I didn't want to do it. So I put out the word that to the Hill that I was available. Nothing happened. Then a friend, Mike McLeod, who was a Talmadge protege, suggested to Beau that he hire me because he knew Beau was looking for a writer in his campaign. The irony of that is that about a year before then, when I was in the Talmadge office just hunting for news, the press secretary gave me the information that Beau was planning to run against G. Elliott Hagan, the incumbent Democrat.
Would Gordon Roberts have been the press secretary at the time?
That is correct. Gordon, I think, always had his issues with the chiefs of staff, and he gave me that little tidbit of news. It was a minor story for the Constitution because the 1st District, of course, is on the coast, a long way from Atlanta. We did have some circulation there. So I went in to see Beau, who's the nicest guy in the world, and I said, Beau, I understand you're thinking about running against Ellett. And he said, yes, I am. He kind of laid out his concept of how he would do it. He had a lot of roots there and had actually worked for Hagan for several years before. He went to work for Talmadge. And then after saying all that, he said, but of course, that's off the record. And I said, well, that's not the way it works. It's off the record if you say that in the first. He said, oh, Bob, you can't run that because if you do, I'll have to quit. Because Talmadge would not be able to let me stay in his employ.
Because he was still chief of staff at the time. This was before Dan Minshew came,
He would not be able to let me continue to work for Talmadge if I was going to run against an incumbent Democrat. And I said, well, I'm sorry, Beau. I mean, it's just not my problem, I said, hopefully in a more polite way. So Beau had to resign that day. He's married with 2 children, and off he had to go back to Georgia sooner than you would think. As I grew older and got married and had 2 children, I think about what an uncomfortable situation that would have been. However, I did tease him later with some truth. I think he might have just sat around in his D.C. office and planned the campaign forever, whereas moving back earlier, he had well over a year. He worked with an REA co-op in Jenkins County and traveled a good bit and kind of refreshed all of his connections. So anyway, back to Mike McLeod. and Beau, talked to Beau. He was very anxious to get me to help him. So I resigned my job. I think I left, got my little two-seater sports car, put a few possessions in it, drove to Savannah, Georgia, and on a Sunday was at WTOC TV in Savannah, writing TV commercials for Beau, knowing nothing about TV commercials, not that much about Beau. It was a kinder, gentler time in terms of commercials then. These were basically Beau sitting on the edge of a desk talking about his plans. And it was unusual to do TV in a congressional race outside of Atlanta, and it was very effective. And Beau was well known and a very superb politician, maybe the best natural politician I've ever known. And he won his primary. The Republican opponent who had signed on when Elliott Hagan would have been the nominee withdrew. Beau Callaway, then the Republican leader, and I think at that point
He would have been national committeeman.
He might have actually been he wouldn't have been Secretary of the Army yet.
Yeah, that was 73.
But, under Nixon. He tried to get Beau to change parties, which Beau didn't want to do, and said, well, I'm going to get the Republican Party to, in the first district, to nominate you too. You'll be elected on both tickets. And then, in other words, then Nixon will try to persuade you to be a Republican when you're sworn in. And Beau didn't particularly want to do that. Neither did the Republican committee in first district. They just had no candidate. And so Beau was, I served with Beau as his legislative director and press guy for the first few years, and then later did press, speech writing, and chief of staff job. Beau was a great member, a very interesting life story that's a separate interview.
Well, I want to step back. Yeah, Beau had worked for Elliott Hagan, and he decides to challenge his former boss in the primary. Was there a reason? Had Representative Hagan opened himself up to a primary challenge, or was this something where sort of the young Turk wants his chance at serving in Congress? What was the rationale behind running in 72, I guess it would have been?
Elliott was not a bad person, but I think he had just kind of worn out in the job, and it was that was pretty well understood in the district. He wasn't that old, as I recall, but he was not a dynamic personality. And frankly, a lot of people who had dealt with him during Elliott's tenure were really dealing with Beau. Beau was completely the opposite personality. Not that Ellett was not an introvert, but Beau was just a people person.
Sure.
And a problem solver for people, and loved it. I don't know, next perhaps to Bill Clinton. I've never known a politician who was so good one-on-one with people.
That's very high praise.
It is. I don't know Bill Clinton other than having met him, so I don't know what's natural and what's not, but with Beau it was natural. He used to complain he would be overscheduled, and if we would cut his schedule or a weekend, he wouldn't have anything to do. That would last about a day. He needed to see people. So, interesting guy and a wonderful person to really help me learn the trade. Here was a case, not the case with my other members or with my next member. Beau was a very experienced Capitol Hill person. I had some knowledge of journalism and media and writing, so I actually learned a great deal from Beau. It was a real blessing for me. And Beau, after he never really had a serious opponent. He had statewide interests. Really always wanted to be governor, and in his last term, he really basically, against my advice, but with my support, ran for governor and was defeated. And
why did you advise again? Because it would have been an open seat. So this is the 1982 race. So George Busby's 2 terms are up, or would be up at that time. Why were you advising against it? It seemed like it would have been a wide open primary, which it was, of course. But.
You know, as we may be about to find out here on the eve of another governor's race with a former senator running, a governor's race is very different from a Senate race. I think if Beau would run for the Senate, which he wasn't going to run against Herman Talmadge or whoever, he would have won. But in just different constituencies, a governor in Georgia with a strong governor situation, governors control a lot of appointments. A lot of the state legislature is very engaged on who is governor. Less so in a federal office. And Beau had, Atlanta, it was always an issue. Beau had worked to cultivate a good number of folks in Atlanta.
Sure.
But it was just a challenge, and I think in the course of that campaign that became clear. So he was defeated, and then he actually set up a government affairs business with.
Well, tell me about that. You would have still been in Washington. Were you still in contact with the campaign, or did you go to work for the campaign?
I went off the payroll for the last 3 months, I guess. Maybe a little longer, I've forgotten. I wrote the issues book we had and did speech writing and actively worked in the campaign.
So you would have worked in the general and the runoff?
Well, it wasn't a general because we lost in the primary.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah,
the primary and then the primary runoff, excuse me.
I did.
So what do you think, Joe Frank Harris, state representative from the Cartersville area, Bartow County, Cherokee County, why do you think he was was it simply because he was Tom Murphy's candidate that he was able to win that nomination? Talk about a contrast of personalities. Joe Frank Harris versus Beau Ginn. Pretty night and day.
Hadn't thought about that in a long time. I'm sure I would have had a better informed recollection. I think it was, again, because of state legislative support. Joe Frank's consultants came up with a great campaign slogan, "No New Taxes."
Yeah.
Which was fascinating. I remember going to some of the very early primary candidate rallies where you had a number of people running. Nobody was talking about taxes. It wasn't really an issue. In fact, most of the candidates, and these are all, of course, conservative Democrats, and this was all a Democrat game in that era, talked about the things you might want to spend resources on. And Beau, when asked about that, would say, well, I'm not going to take a vow that I'll never raise taxes. I don't know what the economic situation will be, and who knows what we need. He was very big on education. Beau had been a teacher right out of college, out of ABAC.
I didn't know that.
And had a very strong feeling for that with teachers, and had the strong support of teachers around the state. But it's a great slogan. I wish I'd thought of it, looking back. And coming out of Washington is hard, even in that era. And so those things all came together.
So, what would you say Beau Ginn's major accomplishments were in his 10 years in the House of Representatives? Because, as you said, he was retired from politics after that. But
won't do him justice in this, but Beau was a doer. He was a creature of Congress.
In the best way, I assume.
In the best way. He became an appropriator as soon as he could be. This was in the era when appropriators, it's the Charlie Wilson's War era, where appropriators did a lot of things in almost every arena. And I can remember literally before Beau was sworn in, after his first election, what is now the bridge over the channel at Brunswick Harbor was a drawbridge, and there'd been a terrible ship accident that had dropped the span.
That's right.
Into the darkness of the night, and people were killed driving across the highway because they didn't know the bridge was out. So Beau was there on the ground 2 days later with me, well before he was sworn in, trying to figure out how we can get the money to get this put back together in a hurry. How did it happen, etc. We began to, this was post-Vietnam wind down. There were going to be some major changes in military installations. Glencoe Naval Air Station in Brunswick was going to be closed. Hunter Army Airfield was going to be closed. Fort Stewart, Georgia was going to be put in caretaker status, put a fence around it and mow the grass. This is a 280,000 acre largest Army installation east of the Mississippi River and land area. Beau went to war on preventing all of those things. So over the course of his tenure, he was able to have the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center be established at Glencoe, one of the biggest employers in Glenn County now. Stopped the closure of Hunter, and was very instrumental in getting the then 24th Infantry Division to move into Fort Stewart. He did that with the support of the chairman of the Military Construction Subcommittee, House Appropriations in that era, who was from Florida. I don't recall his name off the top of my head, but we had to get his intervention for military construction. Beau took him on a big tour of the coast in that era. This gentleman desperately wanted to shoot a deer on Cumberland Island, I believe. He had heard for some reason that the deer on the Georgia Islands were a real trophy, which is, I think deer hunters would say not. Flew out in a helicopter to Cumberland Island. He hunted, he shot a deer. We put it in the helicopter, brought it back. He was happy. We got the money. Beau worked hard with the Department of Army to press for the division coming to Fort Stewart. And it happened very swiftly. And so the Army moved in. It's had a huge economic impact in that part of
Would Beau Callaway have been Secretary of the Army at that point?
I'm trying to remember the year.
73, 74 would have been Beau Callaway, that is.
I'm not completely sure that he was. I'd have to go back and check. But it was a legitimate issue. This was not a created out of politics issue. This was a it was overcoming competitive politics, because many installations wanted that kind of unit, as was subsequently, actually under President Carter, the Kings Bay Naval Submarine Base being located where it was. Beau was deeply involved in that. We knew the Navy was looking for a place for that installation. The Navy, being the Navy, denied that they were looking where they were going to ultimately put the East Coast version. They built the West Coast version first in Bangor, Washington. Then, of course, they did want an East Coast installation, and there was a competition for that. And Beau was very, very much involved with setting that up, and then subsequently getting an extraordinarily high number of impact aid dollars to help the community prepare for that, from interstate exchanges to fire departments to all kinds of schools help to make that happen. Beau try to do those things in Atlanta as well. He did a good bit of work at Fort McPherson.
Okay, yeah.
And talked about that. You got to remember, in that era, military was a bigger part of the economy.
Right.
Lockheed was obviously always a big defense
the Cold
contractor.
War. So.
I cannot tell you how many C-130s Beau got funded in the early days. C-130s, for people that don't know, is the 4-engine turboprop kind of workhorse cargo plane of the Army, and a classic example of the I call it the big lie of the earmarks. The media would say these are just pork barrel projects, and the Air Force generals would sit at a table in a hearing and declare that no, we don't need these C-130s. Meanwhile, they would be having a meeting with you, telling you where they desperately needed them to be based, and so you would be adding those monies, and so I think it was into almost the 1980s before the Air Force ever actually requested a C-130. All the C-130s flying, the ones that flew me around in Vietnam, were all congressional earmarks. But many stories like that with Beau. And Beau was a problem solver on a one-on-one basis. A kinder, gentler time, he literally signed every letter that went out in the office from the 1st District. We would haul a big batch of letters over at the end of every day, and he would flip through them, and he would know almost everyone. He was just a people person.
About all the military appropriations, now a lot of focus, attention, and credit has flown obviously to Senator Nunn.
Absolutely.
Did I assume Representative Ginn and Senator Nunn cooperated a lot on all these projects
Absolutely.
that you had talked about?
Absolutely.
So what was that process like, working across the big hall, working with the Senate and the House offices?
I'd say a team effort. Senator Nunn did not do earmarks, interestingly. He always had a way to help, and he was, of course, very active in the defense arena from day one. So it was a partnership, but I would say pure parochial issues, Beau would be way, way out front. Senator Nunn would be very engaged. I'm thinking, well, say at Warner Robins, I think I had this straight. Warner Robins, of course, was and may still be the largest industrial employer in the state of Georgia. That's not generally known. And Beau would work to help Robins, too, for that reason. Senator Nunn, I think, never did any kind of earmarks for that, but he did set up or facilitate the Mercer Engineering Research Center, which is in Warner Robins, and which is a magnificent institution that does a lot of work at Warner Robins and generates a lot of income in the local community for that. So he would do things like that, and there would be literally a book. There is a book written about everything Senator Nunn has done for defense and in the state. And I've seen him go to bat on some parochial issues, the fighter aircraft manufacturing out of Lockheed, when Lockheed was wanting to move some of that to Fort Worth. This was not on my watch, but it was before I was there. And the Lockheed people came in to explain to him why it needed to go to Fort Worth, and they did not know as much about the cost dynamics of that as Sam Nunn did. Senator Nunn in that era with the Armed Services Committee staff, probably, certainly when I was there, the best foreign policy defense staff in the country, to include the executive branch. So he knew more about.
Is that when General Pinaro was on staff?
Yeah, Arnold, a dear friend, and a great resource for in so many ways. Arnold started as the assistant press secretary, so.
Oh, okay.
And worked his way up.
It makes a lot of sense now that you say that.
No, Arnold's definitely wonderful. I have to divert to an Arnold story.
Absolutely.
Beau put all of the Georgia federal wildlife refuge islands in large part of Cumberland into the wilderness system, and was a big supporter of the Cumberland National Seashore that Bill Stuckey actually got going. And there was concern in the Park Service that the dredging for Kings Bay might penetrate one of the aquifers that would have affected groundwater on Cumberland. And the Park Service wanted the Navy to do a monitoring program for to measure what's happening in terms of salinity and so forth in the aquifer, and to do it over a 4 or 5 year period. The Navy is a vital part of our defense system, but a very arrogant department, I think, in the way it deals with a lot of things. And they were resisting doing this. They just didn't want to be bothered, and they didn't want to spend it would have been $3 or $4 million over several years, but remember, we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars for Kings Bay. And I had been unsuccessful with working on that, and I think this was in the Lindsey Thomas era when this was happening. And I called Arnold, who at that point was the Chief of Staff on the Armed Services Committee. He called the Navy together in a meeting in his very big office in the Russell Building. I did my little pitch. Arnold were concerned that the dredging might have this negative impact on Cumberland, and we're hoping that the Navy can be persuaded to do this monitoring. And Arnold, the Navy started to explain why they didn't want to pay for it, and Arnold said, no, there's no way that the senator and the congressman can run any risk that this would happen to Cumberland Island. So he turns to one of his aides and says, fence the money, fence the dredging money, which would mean in the authorization bill the Navy could not dredge anything unless they agreed to do the monitoring. And some unfortunate soul in the back of the Navy room said, well, sir, how would that work? And Arnold looked at him and said, that's not an executive branch action, this is a congressional action. The meeting is over, period. So, needless to say, the Navy changed their minds. That was, and I think stories like that I enjoy telling and laughing at, but it reminds me that people don't understand the federal bureaucracy is a huge bureaucracy. And there's a feeling that if Congress is intervening on something, it's got to have some scurrilous motive or whatever. And sometimes I guess it's true, but really that's the people's only input. There was no way in heck this was going to occur without that kind of intervention.
Obviously, this is skipping ahead, obviously, and we can come back to your transition from Ginn's office to Thomas's office. But you know that anecdote that you just told about the committee process, and you've spent a lot of time talking about the Appropriations Committee and the work with Senator Nunn and then the Armed Services Committee, and I'm thinking about how regular order works in the House and Senate, mainly the Senate today. Right. How has that changed? from your time in the 70s, 80s, 90s to how the committee process, the markup process works or doesn't work today in our current political environment.
That to me is the most compelling issue in this town, and we're sitting in the District of Columbia. It's awful, and we, as we do this interview, here we are in February for a fiscal year that started in October. We're operating under a continuing resolution in all aspects, which freezes, let's just take defense, freezes almost all of the innovative programs and important programs that the Department of Defense wants. I think it should be an impeachable offense for Congress to not pass a regular order defense appropriations bill. If you wanted the best thing you could do for Vladimir Putin right now is to have a continuing resolution going on. It just wastes an enormous amount of money and prevents the Defense Department from doing what it needs to do to most effectively use the money. Now, how did that happen? It happened because both houses of Congress, in both parties, in the leadership, has decided in the last 5 or 6 years, I guess, that they will tell the committee chairman and committee ranking what to do. They will take over. They will write the bills. Going back when President Obama first came in, and he wrote, and we had huge appropriation bills that were really written in the House and Senate Democratic leadership staffs offices with very little input from committees. You've taken away the authority for big decisions from the committee chairs and the whoever's the minority, whichever party is in the minority. And this is, that's why you have these terrible, monstrous omnibus appropriation bills, which most of the time have not had good hearings. You've not had give and take at the committee levels. Appropriators, House and Senate today, if you told them this is how much money you've got to spend and just get out of the way, they would work it out. And there would be give and take between the parties at subcommittees and full committee levels. And at the end of the day, there may be disputes, but you will have minority party members who have some stake in things that are in the bills and will defend them, maybe cross party lines as necessary to do them. And it doesn't matter, again, emphasize, this is not a Democrat problem, Republican problem. It's a joint decision that the leaders in both parties have made over recent years. And if I had a magic wand to change anything, that would be it. Just if you kind of give the members of these committees the knowledge that they can't impact anything, then it becomes a press release operation. If I was back on the Hill in this era, I would be a great aide because I can write a hell of a press release. If you tell me that it doesn't have to be connected to fact and that there's no consequence, I can dream up legislation all day long and have the House or Senate council, prepare a bill, and I can write a great press release about it. Nothing will happen, but I might get a few clicks and websites and things like that. So it's a big problem.
I guess today, Bob Hurt would have run a mean Twitter operation.
Oh gosh, the whole thing of journalism today, I just am despondent about that too, because when I was a reporter with the Constitution, in a morning newspaper, of course, I would have kind of all day to work on a story, and I really didn't have a major deadline until 5 p.m. These days, Tia Mitchell, who's the AJC bureau person here, she's having to cover, if she's in a hearing, she's having to tweet from the hearing room so that her message can be gotten out before other people, and it's not. That said, institutions like the AJC that have editors and there's some accountability of the reporters is a linchpin, and of course, because of the nature of media today and the economics of it, you see less and less of that, particularly a problem in local governments. But,
well, before I turn this into a true doom and gloom situation, we could work our way back to your time on Lindsey Thomas's staff. How would you compare Beau to Lindsey Thomas? And this is obviously Lindsey Thomas succeeded Beau in the 1st Congressional District.
Yes, Lindsey was running in Beau open seat, a big primary, first time in 10 years it had been open. So he had a number of candidates, Democrats, and he defeated them and did well. Very different, but very similar people. Different in that Lindsey, of course, had been a farmer, started as an investment banker out of Savannah, but is from that area on the coast, and was an active farmer in an era when farming and agriculture was very challenged in Georgia.
Farm
protests and such. And so I met Lindsey actually in Leadership Georgia when he was sort of the responsible spokesperson for family farmers, and is of the land and of the people and knows it. Worked in the paper mill and so forth.
Well, he still has his farm.
He does.
Screven County?
Grace Acres in Wayne County.
Wayne County.
In Screven, Georgia, in Wayne County.
That's right.
A good friend to this day. But he did not have, obviously, Beau government experience, but he had Beau rooted knowledge of the people in the area, and was also a people person in many respects. Naive about politics is not the right word, but refreshing. I remember at times Lindsey never had a hard race after his election. He always won with big. But to this, I still remember one time he was just driving around his pickup truck and he saw somebody else's pickup truck that had his opponent's bumper sticker, and it must have been from his home county, and it just really made him mad. He wanted to follow the guy and find out who it was so he could figure out how to talk to him and find out what went wrong.
Very earnest.
You can't really do that for a few 100,000 people. But so I was in a different role then. I was the guy who had at that point in D.C. 12 years experience and knew the system, knew the district, but not in the same way that Lindsey did, because he could hold his own with anyone there. So that was a.
So how would you describe his politics? Was he sort of the quintessential conservative South Georgia Democrat of that time period?
Yeah, I'd say mainstream conservative. It was a kinder, gentler time politically. I remember asking him early on when I was, actually even before I actually started working for him, is what had been said in the first campaign on things like abortion hadn't even come up in his campaign. It was much more, less guns and knives in that era. Don't get me wrong, there was always controversy about government and big government issues, but I think people listened more carefully, and we did not have the nature of media that we have today that inflames issues which, in my experience, probably 8 times out of 10 have no basis in fact. There'll be a rumor on the internet. President Obama is going to confiscate all of the NATO caliber ammunition, and people will believe that.
That's a throwback conspiracy.
Yeah, and people hear that, and I mean, there's enough NATO round ammunition in closets in South Georgia to fight World War III right now. So, and I'm not I've got guns myself. I understand all that, but not the madness
right.
that can spring from those kind of things.
You mentioned agriculture. Was that sort of Representative Thomas's focus in the way that appropriations was Beau Ginn's focus and education was his focus?
Lindsay started on the Ag Committee, and then later, as soon as he could, got on the Appropriations Committee and on the Ag Subcommittee. And so followed the same track as Beau to use the appropriation process for things in the district, which he did to great success. The Talmadge Bridge that you see in Savannah, funded largely by his earmarks. The bridge over the Harbor Channel at Brunswick, same thing. Money at the military installations.
Right.
Again, that's a book by itself, the things Lindsay did. And in an era when, and actually Jack Kingston continued that tradition as an appropriator. Earmarks did become crazy, and with process was being abused, I think. But ironically, when Speaker Boehner decided to basically stop earmarks, the process had been reformed dramatically. Really, Jack Kingston took a lot of lead on the criteria. It became a very open process, but it was not to be. There's always a rumor that's getting ready to come back, and I hope it does, and I hope it's open to public scrutiny, but it's really the only way that you can impact public policy. The president can do things in the executive branch, but it's a big country, and the president does not get down into the weeds, we would hope. And federal bureaucrats, today, the way things work, if I was assistant secretary of whatever and Congress was mad at me, I would go to the hearing and just, take my verbal whipping and go do whatever I wanted to do, because if you're not going to take action on the budget and appropriations of a federal department, then why does it matter? So
that's an interesting take on earmarks and the earmark process, because what you mentioned, I think, in my sense about earmarks and the general public's understanding of earmarks is, everything's $100 million for the Center for Mice Aerobics and things like that, of that nature. The things that always get written up on the internet of $50 million to see if soybeans respond to Mozart music and stuff like that. But the way you're describing it is more of an tactical a tool, basically. Is that what it is, to grease the skis, or to make government work in a way that at an individual level?
I think it can have that positive effect. There definitely were abuses of the earmark system, and they should have been corrected. In earmarks, which in full disclosure as a consultant, 25 years, worked also on the outside for a lot of earmarks, particularly in defense, but for the Port of Savannah. Port of Savannah actually is a good example, the deepening of the channel, which is ultimately $1 billion project, probably the biggest public works single project in the state history, and it's paying gigantic economic dividends already. The earmark process was used in the increments of appropriations for that in the early days. Congress was very much involved. The Corps of Engineers, actually under Bill Clinton, the OMB, did not want to deepen the harbor channel. They just don't like to spend money on harbors in that era. And it was intervention, political intervention, and adding funding to the appropriation process that kept that moving until and at one point the OMB was trying to block the authorization of that, and Joe Westfall was Secretary of the Army for Civil Works then, and well-known, actually had worked for Lindsay in a caucus, Sunbelt caucus thing, and Joe refused, told OMB, no, I'm not going to pull that out of the bill, and we told him we'd do it, and the president can do it if he wants to. You're OMB, you can tell him you want me to do your dirty work, and I'm not going to do it. So that kept the
What year would that have been? Reagan Bush era?
It would have been Bill Clinton era.
Oh wow, Clinton. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yep. Mm-hmm. It's been a long time going that project.
So tell me, why did Congressman Thomas decide to step away from politics? Did obviously that was a reapportionment year. Did that have anything to do with it, or was it just he decided to step away from politics?
No, we had a good district. I went down and actually camped out in the Gold Dome during the redistricting and everything. It was good. It was just the desire there is to keep the coast intact as one entity. In the very early years, I think in the Bill Stuckey era, actually the coast was somewhat split. I think Glenn County was in a separate district, and better to have it all in one because they shared interests. And Lindsay, after 10 years, he had the opportunity to go work for the Atlanta Olympics.
That's right.
And he decided, it was still in the first year of his last term, and he made the decision and made the announcement that he wasn't going to run for re-election, but he kept, full throttle working. He was at an age, a young guy in relative terms and could do other things. And Beau loved governing and doing things. Lindsay loved helping people, but again, he was a person of the earth and water. Lindsay loves to hunt, loves to be there. I'll never forget early on working for Lindsay, and I've told this story in front of him and others. We were in our congressional office, and he was having one of the interminable meetings that we have when people come to see you in that pre-COVID era. And he would be kind of nervously looking at his appointments cards. And at one point, I've forgotten who we were meeting with, he just said, you have to excuse me a minute. And he got up and left for about 5 or 10 minutes. I didn't know what was going on. I was kind of tap dancing. He came back in. I asked later, I said, Lindsay, why did you leave? He said, there's just too much concrete around here. He was like, he'd been shut up in an office for too long and wanted to get out to take a breath of air. And when I went to work for him, even before we agreed to hire me, but I hadn't started, I went down to see him at his home in Screven, and a few minutes later, we were out in the Altamaha River swamp with him giving me a tutorial about bottomland hardwood forests and the importance of the waterways and the environment and so forth. That was his milieu, and that's where he loved to be. So he did work in Atlanta, obviously, with the Olympics and et cetera, but he didn't have the grinding congressional schedule.
Sure. So do you think, you mentioned Jack Kingston, who was the first Republican to represent the first district ever, probably. I guess you probably could have gone back to the Reconstruction era. Do you think, had a Lindsay Thomas stuck it out and stayed, that the first district could have remained in Democratic hands, or was there much difference politically speaking from a conservative Democrat like Lindsay Thomas versus a Republican like Jack Kingston in the 1990s?
I think in 82, whatever, when that was, Lindsay could have withstood Jack or other Republicans. But I think when Nathan Deal, I think was the first incumbent Democrat in the delegation to switch.
Yep.
The parties were changing and the constituency was changing. So, in fact, Lindsay and I talk about that a little bit. I don't know if he would probably have had to change parties if he wanted to stay in, and who knows how that would have worked out.
So you decide, your boss is retiring from Congress to go work for the Olympic Committee in Atlanta. How did you make the transition from the House to the Senate to work for Senator Nunn? When was that decision made?
I always say that my employment moves in Congress was the Titanic system. My ship would hit an iceberg of an election or retirement, and I would jump on the next iceberg. It was not, every time that happened, I told myself, when I get my next job, I'm going to spend 1 hour a week doing something that would set me up for my next job, and I never did it. So I had known Senator Nunn for a long time. He actually, in his first campaign after Beau had won the nomination, asked Beau if he would lend me to him to help with some of his writing. And so
this would have been when he was running against Fletcher Thompson.
Yes.
The one competitive race Senator Nunn ever ran.
And Beau didn't want to do that because he wanted me to do other stuff. But I'd known, I did work as a volunteer with, in the last few weeks in Atlanta with Norman Underwood on issue stuff. I did opposition research on Fletcher and some other things out of the Atlanta office. So I'd known Senator Nunn over the years. Obviously, was in meetings with him, and Charlie Harmon, his chief of staff, at the time of this transition. Charlie, I went to Charlie after Lindsay had made his announcement that he was going to retire at the end of his term, and I said, Charlie, it's your turn to get me hired. And he said, how about my job? Because Charlie was going to go back to Georgia to be president of the Georgia Chamber of Commerce.
Right.
And so Charlie helped me in the entree into that, and with Senator Nunn. So.
Okay. So you've mentioned somewhat Senator Nunn's approach to politics. What about his style? Again, you seem to work for three very different types of boss in Beau Ginn, Lindsay Thomas, and Sam Nunn. How would you describe Sam Nunn? And obviously, this is Sam Nunn in the 1990s, Sam Nunn in his last term in office, but how would you describe his personality and approach to politics?
Very professional, very strong student. Really, at that point, I think in his first term, he was actually operating pretty much like a House member. He was on an airplane back to the state all the time, and kind of kept that schedule. But he probably had a gift that very few have. He could sit through a long hearing and listen to a lot of blah blah, but he would know the one or two questions to ask that would sort of illuminate whatever the issue was. And I wrote lots and lots of memos to Senator Nunn, and you better be careful, because he would actually read them, and a year later he would remember something you said. So it was scary in that way.
I think Gordon Giffen said the same thing about his memo.
Yeah. And it was a pleasure, actually. It was a hard job because it was long hours, and it was all hard work, but it was all work for the issues of the day. I had the honor and responsibility of everything that went into his inbox I was supposed to read first. Not that I was going to override anything that the Armed Services Committee memo on so-and-so said, but he just wanted somebody to know what everybody was doing. So I got to see the scope of everything that's happening. At that point, he's obviously a senior defense guy, and again has the best defense national security team around, so it was a complete delight. My job, though, was not national policy. Senator Nunn never described this to me this way, but basically I think in addition to sort of supervising the very excellent staff that was already there in the personal office, I felt my job was to meet very important people who thought they were going to meet with him, but found out they were going to meet with me instead, and to somehow make them feel good about that. So, I did have a lot of those kind of interactions. My office door connected into his main office, and also a lot of times I would be kind of the warm-up act if we had folks coming up that he didn't need to spend a lot of time with. They'd sit in my office and we'd talk through the issues. It was a legislative issue, I'd have the legislative director there, and then Senator Nunn would come in and sit in on that for the last 5 minutes or so to kind of get a quick update, and they'd leave having met with him. Many demands on his time, so it was hard. He couldn't be everywhere, but nobody worked any harder, I think, in the office than Senator Nunn. I tell people who are looking for jobs on the Hill, if you get an offer, House or Senate, let me know who it is. If I don't know them, I'll try to find out what it's like working in there, because you can be a legislative assistant in Office X or legislative assistant next door in Office Y, same job, same money, and you can be miserable in one and happy in the other. It just depends on who's running the show and how they treat people as employees. So.
Now, had you replaced Roland McElroy, or had Roland already left?
No, Roland had left.
Okay.
Roland was Roland working for Chuck Robb?
Okay.
There it was Charlie Harmon that
Okay.
was chief. Chief of staff on the personal staff, not...
Right. So, 96, I guess 95 rolls around. When did you become clued in that the senator would not be running for... Because it came as something of a shock for the political establishment back home that Senator Nunn wasn't going to run for re-election in 1996. When did you become clued in or read into the fact that he would not be seeking another term?
Charlie, when Senator Nunn hired me, said, I don't know if he's going to run. I bet he won't. He said, if I had to guess, and I always had kind of the marching orders to be ready to run. I sat in on the meetings with senators who were going to be up in that cycle. I was in a White House meeting with President Clinton when they were talking to offices as a group, the staff people who would be running, and so. But I was not surprised about it. It was interesting. I think at one point, people were asking Newt Gingrich then about Senator Nunn. We ought to get somebody to run against him. And it's interesting. I kind of wonder what would have happened if Newt said, "Yeah, we're going to take him out. He's afraid he's going to get beat." I would not have been at all surprised if that would have made him resolve to run again. And I think Newt was smart enough to probably know that. And they worked together. When Newt was Speaker, Senator Nunn and Newt, particularly on base closure issues, Newt was also kind of a doer, so it was a good thing. So it was not a great shock. He Charlie Harmon actually had helped supervise this. He had a good-sized campaign account. He would have won re-election. But he was at an age where you really had, particularly with 6-year terms, you had to make as he would say, it was kind of a life decision. If he didn't get out at that era, he really couldn't have a second career outside of that.
I see.
And it'd been so he'd been on the Hill as long as I had.
Right. He came in, January '73. Of course, like you said, he really has had a second career outside of the Senate. And it's not a fair question to ask, but I'll ask it. Do you think he could still be the senior senator from Georgia, much in the same way that some of the folks from other states had came in from that era? Your Patrick Leahy's and others who could have just stayed and made a Strom Thurmond-esque, obviously politics completely different, I'm just talking about longevity, in that seat? If
Gosh,
you'd
I'd
wanted
love to put that question to him.
Yeah.
I think so. I think he's a skilled politician, and he would have had to make a calculus of what he would be willing to do to stretch to adapt to new terrain, new political terrain, or not. But I think so. He had Senator Nunn's secret weapon was not very secret. He was a great student of issues. I made the mistake, maybe it was good early on, in helping intervene or work on one of his speeches, and probably wasn't great, but it was good enough where he had me do more of that, even though we had in-house speechwriters who were good. And I saw him at work on what we would call specialty speeches. If he was going to go speak to the Rome Chamber of Commerce or the Ludwig, Kiwanis Club or something, he could do that. He would do that. But if it was a specialty speech to an audience on an important issue, he would really work that hard, and we would send him drafts in, and he would look at them and say, that's terrible, do this and that, and he'd come back. And then finally he would say, okay, I can tell I'm going to do this. And he would write it out in longhand on a yellow pad, maybe using 80% of what you had given him, and then you'd type it. This was really just the beginning of the computer era, and then he would correct it and get mad if the typos weren't right. He would actually write it out again in longhand on a yellow pad. And speechwriters would go nuts because, they would come up with beautiful phrases and they would get scratched out. And I told them, I said, the people he's going to speak to are not going because it's Shakespeare. It's going because it's someone who's thought long and hard about this and is actually telling you something you probably didn't know and is speaking with enough authority on the subject that you should pay attention. And so that was the hard part about speech writing, of course, is always getting jokes. And so we were always looking for jokes that would work. So, but Senator Nunn had been a speaker all his life, so he was.
Who was the best joke? Who could land a joke the best of the three gentlemen you worked for? I think I probably know the answer, but these are the hard-hitting questions everybody comes to.
No, it's important if you're a speechwriter. I think Lindsay could tell a better joke than anybody. Lindsay would start laughing at his own jokes when he was telling them, and that gets the audience laughing. So, if you could do good humor. Senator Nunn, this was before my time, but he was called on to speak at the Gridiron Club, which is an important event, and it's a lighthearted event here. And I think I have this right. Again, I'm hearing this secondhand. He's a freshman senator, but already been taken note of, and I think he actually got some professional joke writing help, and then others, and then actually he delivered. I think he brought the interns into his office, and he did the speech to them to practice it, which, when you think about it, that's really kind of making yourself very vulnerable to, but it's kind of characteristic of the work ethic that he would put in. Now, it's a humorous speech, but it's a very important audience. This is, if you're trying to have an impact in public policy in D.C., that crowd those people were there. So,
right.
And I'm sure it was fun too for him. So.
You were on staff when Senator Nunn and the White House came to blows is probably not the right term, but had disagreements over Don't Ask, Don't Tell, gays and lesbians in the military. What do you remember from that time period, and how and why the issue played out the way it did?
I remember a lot. The one and only meeting that I ever sat in on with, well, no, this was the second time I'd actually been in a meeting with Senator Nunn, and candidate Clinton came by the office. And at that point, Senator Nunn's name had been, this was early on, before Clinton was running. The Democratic Leadership Council, was trying to get their guy, and Clinton ended up, Nunn and Clinton knew each other through that when Clinton was governor of Arkansas. And so I sat in on that meeting in the office. And then after Governor Clinton was nominated, Pamela Harriman had the set police meetings in her place in Georgetown, where senior Democrats would come by and have meetings with him, with the media outside watching the old hands of the party or others coming in to interact with the person who was the nominee. So Arnold Panaro and Senator Nunn and I were there, and it looked a little bit like the pictures you see of people meeting in the Middle East. We'd have a big room with people around the sides and the two principals' chairs, on either side of a fireplace or something, is how I recall it. And Senator Nunn was giving him a briefing really on national security issues and on gays in the military. He said, now, Mr. Clinton, or Governor Clinton, you and I disagree on that issue, but here is what I would recommend that you do. I think he said basically, if you do, when you do an executive order on gays in the military, Jesse Helms or someone else on the Republican side is going to introduce legislation the next day, maybe even the day of, to undo that, and you can't beat something with nothing, so you need to have your own legislative counter-proposal for that. Senator Nunn, not involved in the issue in terms of gay rights generically. It was really, should the military lead the way? He thinks the military should reflect the feelings of the country, but should not be used as sort of the point of entry to make a social policy change. So that was where he came from. So Clinton listened to that and ignored it. Came right out of the blue pretty early in his term with his announcement, and it all unfolded really exactly the way Senator Nunn had expected. And then as it blew up, everybody turned to him to fix it, and then that's how he had the Armed Services Committee staff and Arnold coming up with, I guess we'll call it a compromise, don't ask, don't tell procedure. Arnold and the Armed Services Committee folks would be great to interview in depth on that.
Sure.
Oh, and it was a turbulent time, too. I mean, we had gay rights demonstrations in the office, and it was a time where some of the, I've forgotten the names of the groups, were pretty aggressive to get media. Mm. So we had to, and they were coming to our office and our outer office, and there were a time or two where I kind of manned the phones out front, and we had security around, but nothing. The people that came to protest were genuine, good people. I had many meetings in Georgia with folks on the gay issues. We had gay staff members. So it was not it was a time, because it was a time of change, and no one knew exactly how it was going to shake out. But
well, I mean, it not all too long ago, I think, anybody who's slightly younger than me, has grown up in the current social environment would be hard pressed to recognize the social environment of, say, the late 1980s and early 1990s on
yeah, that issue was resolved.
LGBT issues.
My daughters are 29 and 25, and to them I wouldn't say it's a joke, but it's just such a non-issue that it's a generation has decided that. But that was a time of transition,
Right.
and it was not decided.
I think one of the again I'm telling my age here, but I think one of the first times that I had heard much discussion of a Senator Nunn. Obviously, Senator Nunn hadn't been on a ballot since 1990, when I was 4 years old, but was in 2007, 2008 when there was conversation about vice presidential picks that Senator Obama from Illinois, and Senator Nunn's name was floated quite a bit as a potential vice presidential pick because of Senator Obama's work with Dick Lugar on nuclear proliferation issues, that they had somehow had a relationship or a connection on that. How seriously did you, as his former chief of staff, take that sort of Washington insider chatter on VP picks back then?
Oh, I don't think that was ever really a thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think, particularly because of the gay in the military issue.
Right.
I think a good number of President Obama's constituency would have been outraged about that. Senator Nunn, had he ever been, I'm thinking now about president, if he had been nominated by the Democratic Party to run for president, I think he would have won, but I don't think he would have ever gotten the nomination because of his a Southerner of a type, and the gays and the military issue would have probably weighted that down. Now, Senator Nunn had been asked to be Secretary of Defense, I think, under 3 presidents.
Right.
He never really wanted to do that. He felt he had more ability to influence policy where he was, which is true. He, I think, was interested in Secretary of State position.
Interesting.
And had a long conversation with President Clinton about that, but it never.
Would that have been first term or second term? Because it was Warren Christopher first, right? And then Madeleine Albright.
Yeah, I've forgotten now.
That's an interesting what if scenario.
Well, but then you would have had the blow up we had with Monica Lewinsky and everything. Senator Nunn is a very straight arrow in many ways, but certainly in terms of his faithfulness to his wife and things like that. That would have been something.
Another question for Senator Nunn.
He would have been a great Secretary of State, no question about it.
Right, right. So after, let's do the quick math, 23, 24 years on Capitol Hill, you sort of step away as Senator Nunn steps away. How did Hurt, Norton, and Associates come together? Who was Mr. Norton, and who were the associates?
Frank Norton, a great friend from Waycross, or Ware County, and was drafted in the Army, went to Emory, was planning to go to the University of Georgia Law School, was walking down the street in Waycross after it, and the guy who's the head of the draft board saw him and said, "Frank, what are you going to be doing now?" He said, "Well, I'm going to go to law school." And he said, "I don't think so." And he got drafted. And
foreboding.
he took to the Army instantaneously. Infantry, Ranger School, and just became an officer and combat hero in Vietnam, Purple Heart. He was in the same unit I was in, the 173rd Airborne, at a different time than I was. And I met Frank, and he would alternate his Army infantry assignments with congressional liaison jobs. Frank had been always interested in politics. He had actually had a patronage job for Senator Russell.
That's right, that's right.
And loved it, and very outgoing, great guy. And so Army liaison, House and Senate, is really sort of like the in-house lobbyists for the military services. They all have their own offices, and they handle constituent case requests on things involving military people, but also they take members of Congress on their fact-finding trips. Frank had, I don't know how many, literally millions of miles on Delta flying around the world with senators and House members. So anyway, he was also kind of a car nut like I am, and we hit it off right away, and became personal friends over the years. He retired from the Army as a colonel, full colonel, and then Senator Nunn hired him to be on the Senate Armed Services Committee staff. So after Nunn made his announcement, Frank came and sat down with me. And remember, just because we had announced we were not running, everything kept running. Everybody's after that one last thing, you know, from the senator. So we're dealing with all that, and Frank came in and said, Bob, you may have noticed that we're soon going to be unemployed, and we need to...
sure that had crossed your mind.
So he had this idea, and when Senator Nunn, when he had left, we started the business. Frank sat down and literally on the back of an envelope wrote the names of all the potential clients that he thought we might get, people we knew, and we started operating out of a condo he owned and rented out on occasion in suburban Virginia, and my desk was a bureau drawer top and his was a desk stove top. And we got enough clients that we actually then rented space, and really the business grew. Partly, Frank was an issue expert, but he was really a people person. As someone, a good friend of mine, Will Eddington, told us when we were thinking about doing this, he said, Bob, doing the job is not hard. Finding someone to pay you to do it is hard. And Frank was a great marketeer. So,
okay.
Sadly, died some 10 years ago of a heart attack.
I believe I don't think you would mind me telling this story, but Senator Mattingly and his wife Leslie attended the funeral down at Waycross, and I think that was, I think this is correct, one of Senator Mattingly's only tickets he ever got was attending that funeral.
Yeah, Mac is a good friend and is a good friend to me today still.
So I assume defense was a major portion of your lobbying business. Was that what you specialized in, or was it really across the spectrum in Washington?
I think at one point I did a little analysis of that. I'd say in the high 60%.
Okay.
At our peak of our business because of defense appropriations work. But we represented what was ValueJet and then AirTran. We represented the port always, Georgia Ports, Stardy, and some of our clients, literally as we've done this transition just last year, had been with the company for 24 years, so a long time.
Yeah.
A lot of defense. We worked for all the major defense companies and some of the high-tech companies in Georgia. And I'd say the majority of our clients were Georgia, but they were, we had the good fortune to have clients from California. We've had overseas clients and universities. So a big variety of people. Our business style, too, was to bring in, particularly in the defense appropriation era or just the appropriation era, we would only do that work if the company had a product or service we could verify that the federal entity wanted. Some earmarks were just on a whole cloth. Somebody wanted to make widgets, and so they'd try to get funding for the widgets. But in our case, it was, do we really need this weapon system or
Right.
this service? And talk to the people in the building, as we refer to the Pentagon. If somebody calls you from the Senate Appropriations Committee and asks you, do you want so-and-so, what will you say? And if they'd said, yeah, we want that. So.
We've talked about how regular order and markup process changed from your perspective as a Capitol Hill staffer. How did that change in terms of earmarks, markup, regular order affect how you worked as a lobbyist and government affairs specialist?
We changed a good bit. It went more to government marketing, people trying to sell things to the government. And I'm talking from office supplies to weapon systems. In that case, you don't really necessarily use the Hill at all. Our tactic on that was to find the individuals in the government that actually executed contracts. I used to tell potential new clients, let's say it's a defense issue, I always say avoid the lure of the big meeting. If it's somebody that we took on, we would have figured out whether it had a political constituency from a House or Senate standpoint or some other reason why they could get a meeting. And we could get you a meeting in the Pentagon with Assistant Secretary, whomever, or Undersecretary, whatever, and you can go through the Pentagon, and it's very dramatic, and you can be in a giant room, and there'll be generals and people sitting around, and you'll make your pitch, and you'll show your, in the old days, viewgraph slides or whatever, and you'll leave feeling really good, but the Assistant Secretary does not sign contracts. There's what we call the Iron Colonel somewhere who's actually working out the budget and so forth. And you need to find out if that person really wants this, or why should he or she want it. So we would do the marketing based on that. So, and that would separate us from others who would still be doing the old process. So.
Well, you've been here in Washington now for almost, I guess this is your 50th year.
Frightening.
Well, actually 52nd year since you came in 1970 and never left. How would you describe how politics in Washington, since usually these questions skew more towards Georgia and Georgia politics, but since you've been so ensconced here in Washington, how has Washington changed in the half century that you've lived here, worked here?
I'm hoping that at the Russell Library there's some good political scientists who are going to really do some analytics on that. I've always cautioned myself on looking back on the good old days, because I remember very well as a 20-something staff aide, old people, like younger than I am right now, would come in the office and, yeah, I used to work here, and boy, them's were the days, and we could do this, and we could do that, and so on and so forth, and yeah, right, okay. So I've been reluctant to draw that conclusion, but I do, for the reasons we've discussed earlier, I do feel more concerned about the changes I have seen. The issue I mentioned of the party leaders in the House and Senate, both parties, taking authority away from the committee process, the way the media inflames issues, I'd say call it the online media. The polarization of the Congress is not generated by the Congress, it's generated by the electorate. The people who were the compromisers got kicked out of office. When you see a Bob Portman or people like that leaving voluntarily, you know, that's just what they see. It used to be the old adage of, you have 1/3 is left, 1/3 of the population is right, and then you have the sensible center. There's really, those numbers have changed. There's not much of a sensible center, or let's just say somebody who's open to listening to either side. You don't see that now. So, and you see people like, Lindsey Graham, who was part of the gang or whatever on immigration reform. And he stuck his head up on that and had it chopped off, and he learned his lesson. And he went back, and he's not that way. You have things like the Problem Solvers Caucus and things like that. I hope that people will stop and remember this is a representative democracy, and you have to do some give and take for the system itself to work. And then, of course, you have the cataclysm of January 6th and the lack of confidence in the voting systems. So I say without any reservation, I've never seen things this frightening or bad. Remember, I came here in 1970. The Vietnam War demonstrations were rocking. I had a gas mask in my desk drawer with the National Press Building, and I'd used it frequently. You'd call a number for the Park Service, get a recording of where the demonstrations would be that day. And you had, great disorder in the town. But you could see this was going to change. You knew the Vietnam War was winding down. This will change. And equilibrium in that sense will come back. I'm looking forward to the new generation of staff and politicians to figure out how to get out of this. But people dog cuss Congress, and that's great. It's a valued American tradition since the beginning of the Republic, and you should have a healthy skepticism about elected officials, and it's okay to verbally beat up on them and challenge them in every way you can. But you can't lose faith in the system itself, and I'm worried that that's happening. So I've never seen it in such a state of disarray. There are members here who are working hard and doing good things. I've talked about dysfunction, but there's lots of function. You don't hear about the function. You don't hear about things that are not a crisis. And I wish that people would look for those things. I wish, frankly, the media would cover them more. It's sort of boring, and the poor media now is so challenged because of the economics of journalism now are such kind of a clickbait thing. So can't say that I'm sad to be extracted. I'm still doing some lobbying work for 2 or 3 clients here, but I'm not having to worry about the big picture anymore.
Were you in town for? You mentioned January 6th. Were you in town when that unfolded?
Yeah, my corporate office is right on the Hill. It's a block from the Senate side of the Capitol. I didn't come to work that day, not because of January 6th. I just knew there'd be so many road closures around the Capitol that the commute is a pain. And I, like everybody, watched in abject horror. And anytime anybody I see backtracking by a number of people, I would have people suggest that they get out the House Minority Leader statement and the Senate Minority Leader's 4 statements right after that, and read them back to them and keep those things in mind. It's terrifying.
Thinking back to your days working on campaigns, working on staffs in Georgia, there was always this tradition that there were Georgia Democrats and there were Sam Nunn Democrats and Herman Talmadge Democrats. Is that still a thing in Georgia where Democrats at home are one thing versus the national reputation or the national... Are races now nationalized to the point that there's no distinction between a Democrat in Georgia versus Joe Biden in the White House? I ask this as midterms are looming, and Georgia for the first time since, I guess the early 2000s, it has 2 Democratic senators.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are. You have to look at members individually. Mm-hmm. Let's say David Scott or Sanford Bishop,
sure,
are of a type of kind of. In Sanford's case, he's got a district that can kind of go either way. He's
right. Yeah.
Work with that. Mr. Scott's settled in his way. Some newer Dems, because of their constituency, are very different. So I guess the point of that really is the people who were kind of work both sides of the aisle seem to not be able to do it as much because of the polarization at the top level. I was disappointed that President Obama didn't do more work in that. I think he would have been empowered to do that as an African American on both sides, and President Trump certainly didn't do anything like that. It's up to the voters. They have to decide in Congress what kind of leadership they want to reflect upon, and I lose patience with my friends and relatives in Georgia who say, "Oh, come in on an election, let's say the last Senate election, and I just don't know who to vote for. It's just too complicated to figure out, and everybody's got a spot that says it." And I have to scoff at that. It's never been easier to find out about a member of a candidate because of the internet. May be a bad thing, but it's a good thing. There's never been more information about an incumbent member online. Take the amount of time you take to shop for an airplane ticket to shop for your Senate candidate. It ain't hard to cut through the rhetoric of campaign slogans and look for more about who they are and what they've done. So that's going to be up to the people.
Well, what do you make of?
I might take a little break if you don't mind.
Well, I think we can go ahead and wrap up pretty shortly. Yeah. All I was going to ask is there anything? I don't want to end it on such a gloomy note. is there anything you're looking forward to in your retirement? You said you're still working a little bit, but you got big plans for the years ahead?
Well, I am going to stay involved in things political and campaigns. I'm not going to be giving as many different campaign contributions as I have. And I'm going to enjoy sitting on the curb as this parade goes by and not have to worry about taking care of other employees, which that was always a big challenge. I owned a little office row house building with a tenant in one of the areas. I'm always worrying about the building, and I'm always worrying about making sure everybody else gets paid and all the business stuff that comes with operating a business in the district. So I'm looking forward to not doing that. I've rented a little office a mile from my house so that my wife can kick me out whenever she wants to, and I can go there. And I'm going to enjoy, I'm in Georgia this Sunday for a week, doing various things down there. And I think it'll be more fun because I don't have to be hair and hide tied into it all. And we've got good people. It's a great state. The state of Georgia is much more interesting as a political entity and as an engine of democracy than it's ever been. City of Atlanta, where I grew up, very different today, very dynamic, and from the movie industry to the ports to the airport to everything that's happening all over. It's a magnificent, dynamic place that people want to come to, and I'm excited about that. And I think I would like to see I'd like to find elected leaders and candidates who can do more than just play on the emotions that are generated out of the internet. I'm fond of saying to people who are looking for jobs on the Hill and wondering about the politics of somebody, rather, I would say the only person you'll ever agree with completely is yourself. And you may change your mind on things. So be open to that and respect people that put, elected officials, put the time in. And we've have had them and will have them. Johnny Isakson, whom we lost so tragically, I've never, he was a gifted politician, but he was doing things all the time. And even I knew him as a state legislator. I would see him in a meeting or two on things that had nothing to do with his job. It's just an issue that he was interested in, or somebody asked him, and he was there. Paul Coverdale, who tragically also who died in office. Super issue-oriented guy who couldn't have been any nicer to Frank and me when we were starting our business, and was a great legislative strategist. There's some great people and a great history and heritage that the Russell Library, I know, is documenting in so many ways. So there's a lot to be excited about. We just need people to put down their megaphones and just listen with their hearts and not just their passions. So.
Right. Well, I think we'll leave it there. Bob, on behalf of the Russell Library, thank you very much for taking part in this oral history interview. We really do appreciate it.
It's been an honor. Thank you.